Hello everyone and welcome to week 6, where things are moving very quickly. I wanted to recap a little bit about week 5. A lot of people are experiencing some technological issues and so forth. But before we move on, I wanted to recast a little bit of how you might want to think about your week 5 assignment. I have not yet graded them. I'm going to be grading them, of course, in the next couple of days. They asked for 2 opposing viewpoints. Okay, so a lot of what people who are social theorists think about when they think of social theory or social viewpoints is the two. What is something that's oppositional? Okay, so the first set of theories we dealt with in this class is structural functionalism. It assumes complete social consensus. It assumes that everybody's going to work to the same kind of goals, aspirations, etc., and that anything that doesn't work to those goals is disruptive. Okay, is dysfunctional. Okay, the other theory we've looked at in some degree of detail is conflict theory. Okay, and in conflict theory, what we have is a sort of approach to theory that says, no, people have different aspirations, and some people are blocked from access to the resources that other people have, and moreover, there are people and institutions that are in control of things, that are in control of society, that are going to actively maybe hoard resources and actively deny other people resources. For example, race. The social justice could be a resource, and race could be used as a predication to deny certain groups access to social justice versus other groups, right? These things, they implicitly come into tension with one another. Let me explain. And I had occasion through some of your very useful questions throughout Module 5 to think about this a bit. Okay. And what I thought about, and I want you to take a minute and Google these concepts. In terms of structural functionalism, and many of you, since the vast majority of you are working on Boys in the Hood, I'll talk about that for a moment, right? Only a structural functionalist would assume some concept like a broken home, right? That's really an economic concept. If you had a single parent who made $120,000 a year and one child, that home isn't broken. That child is well provided for, and maybe goes to a private school. That's not a quote broken home unquote. So we want to leave that kind of language aside. That's political language that from functionalism, actually, that says that there's only one ideal way of framing a family, and that's a mother and a father. Okay, so leaving that aside, the family dissolution, which causes some homes to be without 2 parents, is an economic problem, and we have 2 explanations that are contravening and oppositional to one another. From a functionalist perspective, I want you to Google 2 names: Daniel Patrick Moynihan and Oscar Lewis. Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote a book in 1965 called The Case for the Negro Family. Okay, remember that this is language from 1965, and that was standard nomenclature then, not African American or black as it evolved. Okay, so Moynihan was technically a political liberal. He was Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States. He was his labor secretary, And he made essentially a culture of poverty thesis about African American communities, that there was a lot of social dissolution. And this is a time in the United States where there were riots, where Dr. King was trying to start, have the civil rights movement was in full swing. The riots were 2 or 3 years out from this. But the argument was made was a culture of poverty thesis. And that is an argument that was made and leveled against a lot of minority communities where there was economic disadvantage. And that was that, these cultures, these subcultures, or these communities of people have different values than mainstream values. They're culturally prepared for poverty. Okay, well, this is at the very least a sort of odious, at the least, and offensive at the most, sort of a notion. But it was one that was put forth in the social sciences. Okay, as a theory, and if you Google this, you'll see this. Opposite to that, of course, is conflict theory. And in conflict theory, there's a subset called critical race theory that addresses that, indeed, economic access to resources has always been predicated on institutional racism in the United States in a way that advantages whites, over other groups. Okay, notice the tension. I mean, the actual loggerheads between these two perspectives. Okay, and maybe that will help you to clarify. This week, you're going to need to watch, and the audio is sometimes bad, but if you watch the entire video, you will see a discussion between a man named Noam Chomsky, who's still quite alive and still a radical social justice, left-wing, critical theorist on the one hand, and Michel Foucault, the sort of architect of postmodernist thought. He died in 1990. Their sort of debate in 1971. Okay, postmodernism gives us a different perspective. Okay, both functionalism on the one hand and conflict theory on the other hand make assumptions about an ideal society. Okay, functionalism on the one hand talks about consensus about what that is, and critical theory or conflict theory on the other hand, and that's Noam Chomsky's perspective, as you'll see in this video, holds that there's an ideal society, but that we're going to have to shift the institutions of power in order to do so. A functionalist would argue that the institutions of power are just fine; they just need some tweaking, and that everything's going to be okay. That basically, things are there because they're supposed to be there. Their families exist in a certain form because this is functional. Whereas a conflict theorist would argue, no, we need to have a society where every kind of, alternatives to this kind of family are considered functional as well, and where everybody has more or less equal access to resources. Okay, so these two perspectives. A postmodernist, and you're going to hear a lot of stuff, and it can make your mind blow up, right? Assumes they completely decenter any of these arguments by making the assertion that there is no ideal. There's no ideal that we either need to maintain or change through revolutionary forces or in the case of conflict theory, that they're really that perspectives are decentered, right? That there's no real center. Both conflict theory and functionalism assume some sort of a center, some sort of a social, normative center, right? It either needs to be maintained or changed. Maintained for functionalist, changed, for conflict theory. what you're going to hear, and it's real difficult to sometimes hear this video, but you got to watch it, is that there's really, to a postmodernist, there's no center. And what happens is, for a postmodernist, we have to pay attention to the way that knowledge is constructed, because the people who have control, have power, have gained this power through sort of discourse, through controlling the narrative. And so we have to look at the narrative. We have to critique this narrative of power, right? It's kind of a hard thing to get in your mind around. There's no center. In this case, every perspective is correct. Now, basically, you're going to have to, work through this video and work through the audio parts and read the subtext. And there's an English subtext over a Dutch subtext, and the audio quality of it is pretty bad. You can get another version off of YouTube, I think, somewhere, and just watch the 12 minutes that are there. I'm going to look for that right now. But that's the kind of postmodernist argument, right? That we have these systems of discursive regularities that change, that control us, and that there's always power. Somebody is always going to be in power. For a postmodernist, the debate between a social justice perspective or critical perspective and the postmodernist, the social justice perspective holds that we're going to change, overturn through revolution, through transformation, society to a just society. A postmodernist argument is kind of bleak. It argues that there is no just society, really, that there's always going to be somebody who's going to maintain power. That, the people who were social justice, who fought for social justice, when they get power, they're going to be exerting power because they're going to control what's considered knowledge and what's considered power. So that's a hard thing to get your mind around. For this module 6, please, engage this idea, engage this video, read in your text, and I will be responding to you in your discussion posts as soon as possible. I will be, now I've moved and I'm set up with a new computer rig, and so forth. Please keep this in mind as you move forward, and I'll be grading your assignment 5 and giving you some feedback. Okay? Take care and have a great week.